Okay, today's our office hours for April 21st. I am going to say that I have a very bad sore throat and a little bit of a coughing problem. So I am going to jump in here and there, but I'm going to let Dee Dee lead most of this. So thanks, Dee Dee. Okay, today's topics, amendment dates, signatures during virtual meetings, SDI on the IEP, and then IQ for identification. And Dee Dee has some information on just past information about using IQ for identification. So anyway, I am going to kind of just mute myself and let Dee Dee take it away, and I'll jump in as needed.
Thanks, Helen. And I apologize, there was a typo on the previous slide. But anyway, so we wanted to bring a couple of really critical updates to you. And those of you who are with us this morning, you are getting this ahead of the rest of the region. We will be addressing this at our May Special Ed Forum to bring these updates, to everyone, but you're getting a sneak peek. So we wanted to let you know that a couple of things that have come up during selective reviews that are happening right now that represent a shift in what had been previously been established from OEC. And we are seeing this pattern, even though it's not coming out officially yet. In our conversations with OEC, we feel confident and comfortable in saying, yes, this is a change, that is happening, and we wanted to make you aware. So we have always trained regarding amendment dates, what you see on your screen. This is directly from our training slide. We have always said that when you have an amendment, the amendment date is the date that obviously the team meets to amend the IEP, whether that's one person over the phone with the parent, whether it's face-to-face, it doesn't matter. That's still the date of the amendment. And we have always said you have to revise the meeting date and change the start date to match. However, you never change the end date, because when you amend an IEP, you're not extending the IEP. The IEP is still for, 364 days, but that you needed to change the start date and the meeting date. However, we have seen a definite change in that. We've reached out for clarification and got clarity in writing that we do indeed need to not change the start date. So I'm going to show you the change. So what we have learned is there is a difference between the paper or hard copy of the IEP and what gets reported in EMIS. So for the actual IEP document, you do not change the start date. The effective dates for start and end stay the same, because this is not a new IEP with a new cycle. So you don't touch those dates. So in EMIS, however, you do change the date, and the amendment event date will be the same as the start date. So you can see an example here of an event date of October 1st. The start date with regards to EMIS would be the same date. So that's the start of the amendment, not the start of the IEP. So the outcome and end date would stay the same. And we've always said that you never change the end date. But the amendment IEP event date and outcome begin date have to match. So that means the amendment was done on October 1st and the amendment took effect on October 1st. So really what this represents is just where you're putting it on the cover page of the IEP. And I'll show you visually what that would look like. So previously, we used to say that you would change the start date right here. We are no longer going to do that. So you will have the meeting date up here, which is the date that you meet to amend the IEP, however that looks, in person, over the phone, whatever it is, you're checking amendment. Down at the bottom of the cover page where the amendment section is, there is a place to put the date of the amendment. What we often see is this is omitted. So sometimes folks just jot down the section and they don't really complete the section completely. This is critically important because that is the date of the amendment and it will be the same as the meeting date. Then you will not touch the start and end dates. EMIS needs to extract this date, the date of the amendment, and that is going to be the event date and the begin date, the outcome start date for the amendment. So this definitely represents a shift in change in what we have guided and instructed before. And it again is just a matter of making sure that when your teachers are completing, whether you're using Progress Book or IEP Anywhere or some other software, when they're creating that EMIS sheet that goes to the EMIS coordinator, that they make sure that, you know, that meeting date and the amendment start date match, but that is not the IEP start date. It's the amendment start date. So we just have to make sure that everybody is clear on that.
Dee Dee, did you want to kind of, I think you did, but the fact that the reason this became such an issue was paper versus software.
Yes,
And
thank you,
kind of the
Helen.
idea that we have talked about the drop-down box, but that would be seeing if software would do that.
Yeah, so one of the things that Helen and I thought of is that we're going to suggest to NeoNet and to IEP Anywhere that maybe when you click amendment, maybe there's a drop down box that would appear that would also indicate, you know, the amendment start date. So that it's very, very clear up in the top of the cover page, as opposed to just simply at the very bottom, and to ensure that some of that automatic extraction that EMIS does, or that the software does in preparation for that EMIS page, would pull it from there to make sure that, you know, that's done correctly. So we have no control over that, but we're going to make that suggestion, and hopefully, you know, they'll take that into consideration.
Yeah, because part of this happened too, like Dee Dee said, during a review, and part of the reason, actually, the one monitor was the one that stated exactly what we have said to the region. And the reason I think they were having going back and forth a little bit is because they're not working with a software program. They're looking at that paper form on the web, on OD website, or not website, on their OD page. And it's not as confusing. So like Dee Dee and I said, it would just be an easy fix if we could have that drop down box. So anyhow, that's all I have to say right now, Dee Dee.
Yeah,
I'll
thanks,
just
Helen.
let you go ahead.
So any questions from anyone on what we've just covered? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, great. All right, so another thing we wanted to talk about, and we apologize, we did address this in our March office hours. I tried to demonstrate, but it didn't work. I was doing it the wrong way. And so we went back and did a little tweaking. But we know that there's an issue in our region and across the whole state. Many of you are having virtual meetings with families for ETR, for IEP, for other things, which is wonderful because we have heard across the state, and certainly within our region, every school district has reported, except one, that they are seeing a significant increase in attendance and participation by families when holding meetings virtually. And that's wonderful. So we fully anticipate that most of you will continue to offer that as an option for families. But we do know that it does present some struggles when you attempt to get signatures because families don't have your software. So it's challenging then trying to mail home hard copies and get them sent back. So we have a 4-minute video that we put together to show how you can do that either in Zoom or in Google Meet. We're going to ask you to let us know in the chat box if you would like us to play that for you now, or it is on our YouTube channel and we are going to be sending that out in our newsletter. So we can just give you the link to it if you prefer, or we can go ahead and play it for you now. So if you'll just kind of let us know in the chat your preference, then we'll move forward. Okay, thanks. So I am going to show you where it's at. And then I will also, when we stop recording at the end of our office hours, I will put the link in the chat and that way you can watch it afterwards. So this is going to also be the same message that goes out in our newsletter with a link to the 4-minute video to show you how you can very, very easily get exactly what you need to be compliant, how you can make sure there's an agreement statement, and get that digital signature. Okay, so another thing we want to bring to your attention that is, again, we have noticed over the past year, there's been a lot of conversation at the state level. It is still underway. There are still things being discussed before there's an official rollout. But why we're bringing it to your attention is it has come up in selective reviews that are happening right now. And this is the guidance that's being given. So we want to bring it to your attention because it represents a significant change from what we have trained in the past. So when we think about specially designed instruction and who is listed and how that's listed on the IEP, we have always told you that the general education teacher could be listed as the provider of specially designed instruction. This is especially important, we said, when you have students who are served in the general education classroom and may not have an intervention specialist with them, at that time. We also have always said that both teachers, the intervention specialist and the general educator, could be listed for SDI in the same box if it was a co-taught classroom, and that in the location, you had to just put in parentheses that it was co-taught. So that's been what we've said before. The change in guidance is this: general education teachers are receiving support from the intervention specialist, even if they are providing some of the direct minutes for specially designed instruction. Even if they are providing the direct instructions for the student, the intervention specialist is the one who has, or related service provider, has to be listed under SDI, and the general education teacher gets listed under support for school personnel. And then you have to state how the intervention specialist will support the general education teacher through collaboration, in designing instruction, assessment, intervention, providing consultation, coaching, assistance, etc. This is in keeping with what we have previously trained on how you list CODAs and PTAs, that the related service provider is listed under specially designed instruction, and then the CODA or the PTA or the paraprofessional, those folks are all listed under support for school personnel because they are acting under the direction of the related service provider or under the direction of the classroom teacher when you're listing parapros there. And we've always said in the past, even if the paraprofessional is providing direct instruction with a student, even if they're doing it outside of the classroom, it still falls under support for school personnel because they are receiving support from the classroom teacher, from the certified teacher. So it's really the same concept with the general education teacher, in that we want to see the specialist, the intervention specialist, listed as the provider for specially designed instruction. Even if all of those minutes aren't provided directly from that person, they can be provided by the general education teacher, but that person is listed under support for school personnel. And again, I'm going to kind of show you a visual of what that could look like. So here you see section 7, specially designed instruction, and we have, use our formula that we've always said, specially designed instruction in whatever the content area is, in math calculation to include, and then you list all your methodologies and strategies and the goal. But here we want to make sure that it says intervention specialist, and it would either be in a general education classroom, or it could be in a resource room, or wherever that location is. The change now comes below where you see support for school personnel. So we want to make sure that we're making some kind of statement that the general education teacher will collaborate in designing and planning instruction, assessment, and intervention with the intervention specialist. Gen ed teacher will receive consultation, coaching, and assistance in the instruction of math, or interventions in math, or whatever it is that is being addressed. And again, for support for school personnel, there's no location, there's no minutes assigned to that, just the beginning and end date, which should be the scope of the IEP. All right, I'm going to pause for a second because, again, I know this represents a significant change from what we've done in the past. Any questions or anything that I said that is confusing or unclear?
And I'm just going to add in there, Dee Dee, that this did come up during our reviews, but also it came up early on in an OEC meeting that we were on, and many of us pushed back across SSTs. And this is still in legal, but they're pushing forward with this. So, and like I said, it was marked on with two separate reviews that we have going on with different monitors. So yeah, we weren't happy.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, and that's a good point. I appreciate you saying that, Helen, because many of us did push back and said, wait a minute, we've always said that who better to help provide, intervention in a specific content area than the person who has the expertise in that content area, especially when you get to middle school and high school levels. And so our concern was that by doing this, we would be taking a giant step backwards in the progress we feel we've made for teachers recognizing that all teachers take ownership of students with disabilities, not just the intervention specialists, that it is the responsibility of every educator despite their title. And we were concerned that we would be taking a step backwards. What has reassured us is the further clarification from OEC that we are not saying that the general educator cannot provide some of those specially designed instruction minutes. What they're simply saying is that it needs to be designated on the IEP so that it's clear that there is the person with expertise in intervention, which is our special educators, that they are the person sort of driving the specially designed instruction. That doesn't mean that our general educators aren't providing some of those direct minutes, aren't providing some of that direct instruction, but they are doing it with the support of an intervention specialist. So if you think about it that way, like I said, and you compare it to the way we think about how our paraprofessionals are listed, how our codas and our PTAs are listed, then it makes more sense. And so again, that reassured us that, okay, this isn't really, it's not a change in practice, it's a change in how we document it. So thank you for making that point, Helen.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dee Dee, for going further with that because it did, like I said, we thought it was a step backwards for just inclusion, integration, general ed people taking a little more responsibility. But when it was compared to the PT, the PTA, the OT, the CODA, then it made more sense. And it isn't going to obstruct their ability to take ownership.
Right. Okay, so if we don't have any questions about that, then I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. And we wanted to take just a couple of minutes. We wanted to touch on this back in November and December, and we just had so much content with testing and so many other things going on. Obviously, with the pandemic to cover in our office hours, we just didn't get an opportunity to do so. And so now that things have quieted down a bit, we really wanted to take just a few minutes to reflect on this. So back in October, marked the 40th anniversary of a landmark ruling in the state of California. 40 years. So that's really significant when you think about IDEA having its 75th anniversary this year, and you think about how far we've come in special education, but in other areas, sometimes how antiquated some practices still are happening, so and are in existence. So 40 years ago in California, they banned the use of IQ scores to identify students as having a disability. And there were some really significant reasons for that. Prior to that ruling, they were required to use IQ scores. And we all know that that is still a common practice in most states and certainly here in Ohio. What California found was that although only 9% of their student population was made up of Black or African American students, 27% of those were being labeled as educably retarded. And you have to remember the language that was, 40 years ago. So what they realized was that there was definitely skewed information. There was definitely disproportionate representation. And we know that that is a problem that is still happening today. And that has been the reason why we now have disproportionality indicators, because it is still so prevalent. What we also know is that nationwide, African American students scored lower on IQ tests. That is not because nationally those students have lower IQs. We know that's not the case. What California found out and what they argued was that IQ tests are biased toward Eurocentric culture, meaning that many of the questions and the items that are on there have cultural nuances that may skew the results for certain groups of students and certain populations of students, and therefore should not be considered a valid measure of an individual's intelligence. When California went to court about this, the court examined all the evidence and they agreed that the IQ tests that we have were racially and culturally biased and that they did discriminate against students of color. At that time, California permanently banned the use of IQ tests for placement and also even for identification. As I said, that's one state out of our entire country. So we know that this practice continues today. You know it, you see it every single day on your ETRs. And we just want to pause and reflect on this because we know that we have a problem in our state and in our country with disproportionate identification of minority students. And we know that it's critical that we take steps to mitigate that and eradicate some of those practices. And this is just one piece of that. It's really interesting, and I have a link here. So when we give you the slide deck afterwards, you'll be able to click on this link to some of the research. But it's also really interesting that research has found that educators very often treat Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than white girls who are the exact same age. They're also punished more readily and more harshly as a result. And we know this to be true in other settings outside of schools, but we see the way young Black girls, particularly once they're at the middle school and high school level, are portrayed often in media, in on television and in film, and that permeates our education system, and sort of again those implicit biases or unconscious biases that may exist among educators that they don't even recognize and are not even aware of. Very often, young Black girls are classified as aggressive, and we ascribe adult intentions and adult behavior to them that we would not ascribe to white girls doing the exact same thing at the same age. So we hear comments like she's sassy or outspoken, where if it were a white female of the same age, those same attributes would not be ascribed to the student. They would say that she's confident or that she is assertive. And so just a more positive way of stating some of the attributes and characteristics of a young girl. So again, some of these equity audits have showed that Black students right now are 8.5 times more likely to be labeled as emotionally disturbed. And again, the research supports that that is not in fact the case. That's not true, but that comes back to our system of identification and some of the inherent problems and issues with the way we identify students with disabilities. And again, we know that we've had lots of conversation across our region and across the state, but at our special education forums, as we keep talking to you about the disproportionality indicators and the requirements for that. And this is just a little bit of background about something that's very closely aligned to that, why we now have those required pieces in place, because it is still, as I said, so very prevalent. But we really want to think about, like I said, those unintentional or subconscious biases. There's no other way to say it. Some of those unconscious biases that exist in our schools around Black students, and sometimes, like I said, particularly around young Black girls, and just thinking about the different way that we perceive behaviors from students of color versus those same behaviors from our white students. So again, we just want to bring that to the forefront so that it can be something that is talked about back in your schools and in your districts. Again, the idea is to really create awareness. We know we have our DISPRO indicators, obviously conducting equity audits in your districts and having professional development that specifically talks about these issues. We can't stress that enough. Often these conversations happen as a sidebar or an afterthought in other PD, where we're talking about, serving students with disabilities and access and equity. And then thinking about racial implications is just a sort of an afterthought and a little footnote to that conversation. And we really want to start thinking about PD that specifically targets and talks about our students of color and how often they are identified and in what categories they are identified as having a disability, and remembering to be sensitive to labels. And again, we always want to have high expectations for every student all the time, every day. All means all. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, well, today was kind of short and sweet. We didn't have as many things to tackle, but some things that were pretty critical. So again, as you go back and think on some of the things that we've discussed, if you have other questions or any of it seems confusing, you know how to get a hold of Helen and I. Hopefully we'll see you again next month on the 19th. Our office hours will be from 1 to 2 next month in the afternoon. And as I said, I will kind of end our recording now and then get some of those live links for you in the chat. So thank
Yes,
you, everyone. We appreciate it.
Dee Dee, I have a question.
Sure.
It's back to the first section, the amendment dates. So for the bottom section where it has date of amendment, you know, next to where you list what you're changing, we don't match it to the meeting date. We treat it like the start date of the IEP, where we give the parent time to get the PRO1. Is that not what we're supposed to be doing? Should we match it to the meeting date?
You can do that. You are not required to do that for an amendment in the way you are an initial IEP or a renewal IEP.
Okay.
So an amendment is a little bit different. You know, you can have that conversation over the phone and put it into effect, you know, immediately. If you do that, that's fine. But again, what we would say is make sure then that it is clear that, you know, your staff understand what gets reported on that EMIS sheet and that they're not changing the IEP start date, and making sure that, you know, there's clarity in what gets reported in EMIS. We don't want to cause a bunch of fatal EMIS errors. And we talked at length with OEC about that. So
Right.
yeah, if that's your practice in your district, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. You just have to make sure that everyone understands what your process and your policy is, and that you're doing correct reporting then.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank everyone for being on here, and just say we are kind of rounding the corner. Let's hope. It's getting close to May, and once again appreciate all that districts have done, and families, and for students. So possibly the end is in sight. So hang in there, because I know this is also testing season.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you both.